What's up, everybody? It is a beautiful day outside, and so I figured I'd come and talk to you out here as opposed to sitting inside where it's just like a boring little backdrop. But one of the things that's been on my heart lately, it's been several weeks now that we've all been kind of in the quarantine phase, just sitting inside, and whether your parents are working from home and you're doing school from home or whatever it is, life is definitely different. But it's Easter Sunday, and that's what I'm filming right now is Easter, and gosh, I've just been reflecting so much. One of the things that Aaron talked about this morning is how even though there's like a pandemic, it's like Easter isn't canceled, the resurrection isn't canceled. And man, I've been thinking a lot about that, and how no matter what our circumstances are, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But anyway, man, I've been thinking about you guys a lot, praying about you, and I hope everything's going good. And make sure you guys keep reaching out. I've been talking with students, leaders, getting text messages, emails, and gosh, just so many awesome stories that are going on. But anyway, one of the things that's been kind of on my heart lately is just, with the change of pace and having to really slow down. Like I heard someone put it this way, what we're going through for a lot of people is a divinely imposed Sabbath. A divinely imposed time where we just have to slow down and reevaluate some things. And one of the lessons that I have been learning is, man, I'm a very, very performance-driven person. I like to get things done. I like to see the results of my work, the results of my labor. Man, I like to work hard, and it's really, really satisfying at the end when you can turn around and at least, see or look at what you've accomplished. And sometimes doing things online and working from home, and it's kind of hard to have that same satisfaction of just being able to look back and say, man, look what I accomplished today. And with different office work type things, there's always going to be differences, but that's just one of the things that's been on my heart lately, is because of the changes, because of the difference in the times. It's been so weird sometimes just to think, man, I can't do what I used to be able to do. And for myself, and I think for our culture as a whole, we are very, very performance driven. We are very, very focused on what we accomplish, and what the world says is good, and what the world says is success. And I've just been thinking a lot about that. And in light of that, I've been thinking about this story of Joseph, okay? This is a story that I wanted to talk with you guys about today, because I think there's something really, really valuable that we can learn from the story of Joseph. So if you don't know who Joseph is, Joseph is this guy that you can find in the Old Testament, okay? So in Genesis 37 through 49, you can find Joseph's story. Or actually, Genesis 37 through 50, you can find all of Joseph's story. And he has an amazing, amazing life. And I would love to sit down here with you for like the next 30 minutes and talk about his life story, because it's insane. 13 chapters of Genesis are taken up in Joseph's life, like just the story of Joseph's life. And what's crazy is all of the creation story happens in one chapter. All of creation happens in one chapter, and then they give 13 chapters to this random guy at the end of this book that is the beginning of the Bible. Like, it's really weird, and sometimes I wonder, like, why is it that this guy gets so much real estate in the Bible? But he has an amazing story. And we're actually going to be talking about it later on this summer and into the fall. We're going to be doing a series through Joseph's life, and so I'm really, really excited to dig into that. And that's why I wanted to talk about Joseph just a little bit, because we are going to be talking about him in more detail coming forward. But anyway, what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to give you a quick overview of Joseph's life. I'm just going to talk through some of the highlights. I'm going to tell you about some of the things that he did. And then there's this chapter in the book of Hebrews. It's actually in the New Testament. It's chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews. There's this list of people in Hebrews chapter 11, where the writer of Hebrews talks about all of these famous people in the faith. Sometimes it's called the Hall of Faith. You've probably heard about it. And in that chapter, Joseph has one verse mentioned about him. And we're going to go ahead and talk about that at the end. But for now, I just want to tell you a little bit about Joseph's story and some of the things that he does. So Joseph is this guy. Okay, he's one of the sons of Jacob. Okay, he's one of the 12 sons. So actually, Jacob had 12 sons, and the 12 tribes of Israel actually came from these 12 sons, right? So there's this guy named Joseph. He is in Israel, and his father's name is Jacob. He has all these brothers: Judah, Issachar, Reuben, like all these different guys. There's a lot of them, and they have really, really fun names. But anyway, you're probably a little bit familiar with this story. But if you're not, I'm gonna just catch you up to speed a little bit. So Joseph was Jacob's 11th son, I think, and he was Jacob's favorite. Okay, he was loved way more than the other brothers. In this story, there's so much backstory that I could tell you about it, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to give you the run through. Jacob was absolutely head over heels favoriting Joseph. Joseph was the favorite brother by far. He was given so many more privileges and priorities over his other brothers. And Jacob actually made this really, really nice robe for Joseph that he didn't make to anybody else. And he just loved him so much. And Joseph really kind of ate this up. In this story, in the beginning of this story, Joseph is kind of toting this over his brothers, and he has this dream. And in this dream, he has this vision where all of his brothers are bowing down to him and paying homage to him and saying that he is their ruler and all this different stuff. And so anyway, Joseph really, really makes his brothers mad, and he makes them so mad that they actually lead him out into the wilderness, and they were going to kill him. But they actually they didn't end up killing him. They ended up faking his death to his father. They slaughtered an animal, which is kind of weird and crazy in itself, and they dipped his clothes in it and brought it back to his father, told his father that Joseph was dead, and they sold Joseph into slavery. Okay, I mean, this is back in the ancient Near East, okay? Slavery, literally owning people, this is a real thing. His brothers sold Joseph, his own brothers, sold him into slavery into Egypt. And so Joseph is taken down to Egypt as a slave, and he's given to this guy named Potiphar. So Potiphar is one of the higher, he's a pretty wealthy man in Egypt, and he makes Joseph his servant, okay? And Joseph is working in his house, and Joseph was so amazing, he did such exceptional work that the Bible tells us that Potiphar put Joseph in charge of his entire estate. And the Bible even says that with Joseph in charge, Potiphar didn't even concern himself with anything. He never worried about a thing when Joseph was in charge. And then there was this whole big dramatic thing that happened where Potiphar's wife was starting to hit on Joseph. It was really not a good situation. And this all comes to a head when Potiphar's wife catches Joseph alone in the house, and she tries to get him to sleep with her. Well, anyway, Joseph runs away from her, and he leaves the situation, and Potiphar's wife goes back to Joseph's master, her husband, and she lies to him, and she tells him that Joseph attacked her, assaulted her. And anyway, this makes Potiphar really, really mad. Okay, so he takes Joseph, and he puts him in prison. And Joseph is in prison now. So, okay, he's the favorite son, and then his brothers hate him, and they sell him into slavery, and he comes, and he works for this guy, and he earns favor in his master's eyes. He's put in charge of this entire estate, and then he's in prison again. And while in prison, he meets these two guys, a cupbearer and a baker, that work in Pharaoh's household, okay? And they're both in prison. Well, anyway, long story short, they get out of prison, they go back, and Joseph had actually interpreted some dreams for him, and they tell the king, they tell Pharaoh about this Joseph guy one day, because Pharaoh has this dream and he doesn't know what it means. And so they remind Pharaoh that this guy Joseph is in prison. So they bring Joseph out of prison, right? Pharaoh brings Joseph out of prison, and he comes up, and Joseph interprets this dream for Pharaoh and tells Pharaoh all of this stuff that's going to happen. And Pharaoh is so blown away that Joseph knows all this, and he's so impressed by how well-spoken and all of these different things that Joseph is, that he ends up putting Joseph in charge of all of Egypt, okay? The second in command. And what you have to know about this time is that the Egyptians, like, this is the most powerful empire in the world at this time. Pharaoh is literally the most powerful person on the planet, and he puts Joseph second in command. Joseph is literally the second most powerful person on the planet now, after being sold into slavery, after being thrown in prison, after all these different things. Joseph becomes the most powerful person on the planet. And anyway, years and years and years and years later, his brothers come down to Egypt because there's this huge famine in the land and they can't get any food, and it's just this giant mess. And they come down and they don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes his brothers, and they come down asking for food. And anyway, he does this whole charade, this whole back and forth with them, and they don't know who he is, but he knows who they are. And there's this big dramatic scene, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, Joseph reveals who he is to his brothers, and he sends for his brothers, he sends for his father and for his entire family, and he brings them down from Israel. He brings them to Egypt, and he provides for them, because this famine is like really bad. Like, people are starving to death all over the place. And what's amazing is Pharaoh gives Joseph and his family this land in Egypt. He gives them this land called Goshen. Okay, so, whatever, that might not be an important detail to you, but it's a big deal, because Goshen was that was like Beverly Hills in Egypt, right? Because it was the place with the best land. It was the rich person's place, essentially. And so Joseph and his whole family end up with all this stuff after he's been through so much. They end up with all of this. And Joseph, gosh, I just explained this story to you in like 8 minutes, but literally I left out so much detail, and I could have talked about this story for 40 minutes, just outlining all these different things that Joseph did, because his story truly is amazing. And through adversity and failure and conflict and all this junk that Joseph had to deal with, in the end, he accomplished so much. God was so faithful to him, and he accomplished so much. He did all of these amazing things. He literally saved the known world because of his work in Egypt. And what's really interesting about this guy named Joseph is, in spite of all of his accomplishments, when he's written about in the New Testament, there's this story, or there's this one verse in Hebrews chapter 11 that talks about Joseph, and it says this is Hebrews 11:22. This is Joseph's entire life summed up into one verse. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. What does that mean? Why on earth is that important? That seems like such a stupid thing to say to sum up a life of someone who was so extraordinary, someone who was sold into slavery and dug himself out of the mud to become the lead servant in the household, and then was thrown in prison, and then from prison became the second most powerful person on the planet. That's how the New Testament sums up this amazing man's life? It just doesn't make any sense. I read this and I'm confused. Why is it that they talk about the Exodus and the burial of his bones? Here's why. This is why the author of Hebrews talks about Joseph like this. Because Joseph had the faith that God was going to take care of them. Joseph had faith that God was going to bring his people out of Egypt one day and give them a land in Israel. And so Why is that really significant? So when Joseph was taken down to Egypt from Israel, he was brought down 400 years before the Exodus. So essentially, if this verse is true, Joseph honestly believed that 400 years in the future, I mean, he was going to be dead. He wasn't even going to be alive by then. 400 years into the future, God was going to save his people and bring them out of Egypt. And he was so confident that he instructed his descendants, when I die, I want you to take my bones and I want you to bring them up to Israel with you when you go. And sometimes I just imagine Joseph's children. When he was raising his children, he'd have his son on his knee and he'd be bouncing him on his knee. And he would tell him the story about how one day God's going to bring him out of Egypt. And his son would be like, well, Dad, I don't know. We've been here for like the past 30 years. I don't know what you're talking about. And then 100 years later, maybe Joseph's still alive. And he has his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren and maybe even his great-great-grandchildren on his knee. And it's been 100 years in Egypt. And he's sitting there kind of bouncing them on his knee. And he says, hey, guys, when I die, make sure you take me with you when you go up to Egypt. Or when you go up to Israel. I think what made Joseph so special, what made Joseph worthy of mention in the Hall of Faith, isn't the fact that he accomplished all these amazing things. What makes him special is that he trusted the Lord, and that he had enough faith to trust that God was going to do what he said he was going to do, even if it was 400 years into the future. And it's been a little bit of a crazy time. And when I sit here and I think and I reflect on my own walk, one of these things that just really sticks out to me is that God celebrates the fact that Joseph trusted that the Lord was going to do what he said what he was going to do instead of what Joseph accomplished. Like, that's what God celebrated. God values faithfulness over results. And that's one of the things that I have to tell myself a lot, is that no matter what happens, like in the end, I can accomplish really, really cool things, but if I'm not trusting in the Lord, it doesn't matter. Like, if I'm not seeking the Lord, it doesn't matter. I can do all these different things. I can perform, I can succeed, but if I'm not trusting the Lord, it doesn't matter. And so that's what I wanted to leave you guys with today, was just this message that God values faithfulness. He values faithfulness more than what you accomplish. And that's one thing that I try to remind myself. So as you go about your week this week, I just want you to rest in that. I just want you to be thinking about that and trusting that, you know what, even if you maybe don't get everything done that you want to get done this week or this month, that's okay. Because that's not what really, really matters to God. Anyway, I hope you guys are having an amazing week. Reach out if you need anything. I love you. I'll see you later.